Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Autumn is here. In fact, autumn is here not just according to the calendar, but according to the outdoor thermometer. Often that is not quite true yet here in Washington, D.C., but the local weather forecasters seem to have teamed up with the amazing Victober team here on Booktube to make me really eager to put together a TBR full of Victorian classics. Way too long to actually get through during the month of October. I'm sure all of you have been following all the Victober hosts, Katie at Books and Things, Kate Howe, and Lucy the Reader. But if for some reason you don't know about them or about this event, I'll link below to their introduction videos down in the description box. In addition to the main celebration of Victober, there are a couple of adjunct celebrations, and I'll link to them as well. I think I'll get started today talking about the fiction prompts from the official Victober challenges, as well as about one from a connected read-along. First, Katie at Books and Things challenges us to read a Victorian book that equates to our favorite modern genre. I suppose my favorite modern genre is literary fiction, so I'm choosing to start with a book whose length has scared me off before. George Eliot's classic book, Middlemarch. I can't believe I've not actually read this book yet. Over the course of my life, I've grown to know many of the main characters just because of their importance in not only academic circles, but in the lives of many of my women friends. As embarrassing as it is to admit, I read my first George Eliot only a year ago, and I read it because of the Victober adjacent challenge to knit while listening to the audiobook of Adam Bede. I cheated just a bit and read most of Adam Bede from the printed book, and I absolutely adored it. In many ways it reminded me of Nathaniel Hawthorne's American book, The Scarlet Letter, a novel I know a lot of folks seem to hate, but which I've read and reread over the years and love even more every time I read it. Anyway, I have not yet read Middlemarch, but given my somewhat unexpectedly positive response to Adam Bede, and primarily to the style in which it was written, combined with the fact that many of the readers I admire most, both here on Booktube and in my non-digital life, really love this book, I feel pretty certain that Middlemarch will work for me. Since this is Katie's prompt, I do want to say that at least one of the readers I admire most on Booktube does not adore George Eliot. It feels a little sacrilegious to choose this author in response to her prompt, and I hope she'll forgive me. Next, Kate Howe challenges Victober participants to read a new-to-us work by a Victorian author we love. Although I didn't discover Thomas Hardy until relatively late, a little more than 3 years ago perhaps, I gulped down almost all of his major novels in a very short period. I still have one to go. Jude the Obscure. I know some readers are split on this one. Some feel it's unremittingly dark and dreary, but I have to admit that I'm rather fond of dark books. And the focus on both education and the reformation of marriage norms, shall we say, makes this a book I think I will find fascinating. The next prompt is the Reader's Challenge. I love the prompt that was chosen at the end, but I also really loved a lot of the suggestions I saw in various spots across social media. I had a great time thinking about what I might pick if this challenge was chosen or if that challenge was chosen. One that really stuck out to me was to choose a book by an author with the same initial as your last name. My last name starts with a J, and I couldn't think of anything at all. Can any of you? Please let me know if you think of someone. Well, my first name starts with an H, of course, so Thomas Hardy seemed like a reasonable alternative. And by choosing to read Jude the Obscure, I'll be bringing in my J. Another option was to go by birth date instead of initial or of our last name. I'm thrilled to share a birthday with Anthony Trollope, and I have plenty of books of his still left to read, maybe next year. Anyway, the real Reader's Challenge is to read a Victorian book from a previous Victober TBR that you never got to, or one you've been meaning to read for ages. Last year, I put Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall on my TBR. I enjoyed Anne Bronte's short book, Agnes Grey, but I didn't love it. I know many people feel Tenant is a far more ambitious work and far more resonant for many people. I remember having some conversations last year, near the end of the month, with Brian at Bookish, where he was thinking about the book more as a parent than as one of the heroines. He convinced me that I really had to read Anne Bronte's book sometime soon, and I think the time has come. Brian also convinced me back then that Victober 2020 was the time to reread Jane Eyre. I'm not sure it will actually be one of his highest commitments for Victober, now that a whole year has passed since his words, but I know I would love to talk with him, and of course with all of you. Very luckily, Kate Howe and Emily from Novell Novels are leading a group read of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre as an adjacent project to Victober. Perfect timing. Their reread involves direct conversation by Zoom with each other, as well as a collective viewing of a screen adaptation of Jane Eyre. I've not yet played with my calendar to make sure I can fit the dates of the meetings in, but I definitely hope I can get involved. Because of my interest in rereading Jane Eyre, I suspect I will not have time to participate in the official Victober group read of Charlotte Bronte's novel Shirley. I've never read Shirley, and I very much plan to read it at some point, but I think I've already bitten off more fiction than I can chew this month. Instead, this year I've read a much higher percentage of nonfiction than usual for me, especially biographies and memoirs. Luckily, Victober 2020 has a specific prompt that fits right in. Lucy's call to read a Victorian diary, or a collection of letters. For those of you who've been watching for a while, you might know that I read a lot of diaries and letters from the United States during the 19th century, sometimes published in books, but often in archives or available only as digital manuscripts. 10 years ago, I bought a collection of writings edited by Helena Whitbread, The Secret Diaries of Miss Anne Lister, but I still have not read this volume. Lister wrote her journal in code derived from a combination of ancient Greek and algebra about her experiences as a woman from the beginning of the 19th century through the very first years of the Victorian period, challenging assumptions and restrictions about both gender and sexuality because of the way she presented herself, how she earned her livelihood and accumulated wealth, and who she chose to love. Emma Donoghue calls the diaries the Dead Sea Scrolls of lesbian history. Jeanette Winterson says she takes courage from the way Lister and her partner found a way to live as they wished. And Sarah Waters says these diaries are indispensable for anyone interested in the history of gender or sexuality and the intimate lives of women. Since this is Victober, I think I will be reading a few of the later entries in Lister's diaries, which are not in this volume, but which I can access digitally. In addition to reading a diary or letters from the Victorian period, I have a couple of other works of nonfiction on my possibilities list. One is a new biography of Charles Dickens, The Mystery of Charles Dickens by A.N. Wilson, the author of many, many important books about the Victorian period. From what I understand, this particular text is not focused on retelling the events of Dickens' life exactly. Instead, it's an effort to trace how particular incidents and experiences in his life inspired Dickens to create both the plots of his books and his characters, the roots of his vast and wild imagination, as Wilson says. Although I recognize that this biographical approach to literature conflicts a bit with the whole idea that, quote, the author is dead, and we should be more focused on how novels work, perhaps on close reading the text, still, this historicist approach to literature really works for me and my interest as an historian. The next nonfiction book I'd love to get to is one of the genre I have totally fallen in love with this year, the memoir that mixes autobiography with literary history and analysis. That book is Robert Clark's My Victorians, Lost in the 19th Century, which came out last year, I think. I've only glanced through it at this point, but the book chronicles Clark's 5-year obsession with Victorian novelists, artists, architecture, and cultural critics. The copy on the back cover ends with this line: Clark considers what happens when heartbreak, eros, faith, and doubt drive us to take refuge in the past. Sounds like a perfect book for me. There are 2 more memoir/literary biographies that I really want to read at some point and would love to get to this month. I can imagine that some of them may get pushed to Nonfiction November, perfectly situated to follow Victober. The first is Rebecca Mead's My Life in Middlemarch. Mead read George Eliot's novel as a young person, growing up on the English coast, then continued to read and reread it as she studied at Oxford, became a journalist, had a family, and moved to New York. As the back cover says, she leads us into the life that the book made for her, talking about the complexity of love, the meaning of marriage, the foundations of morality, and the drama of aspiration and failure as it played out in the Victorian period, but also as it plays out in the 21st century. The back cover concludes that Mead's book is for every ardent lover of literature who cares about why we read books and how they read us. Sounds amazing. The final nonfiction book I'll mention here is another literary memoir, A Girl Walks into a Book, What the Brontes Taught Me About Life, Love, and Women's Work by Miranda Kpenton. I can't imagine I'll be able to get to this one during this Victober, but it sounds like I need to find a time to read it very soon. It's the story of a young woman who fell in love with Jane Eyre when she was a pre-adolescent, as did I, and continued to read it and other books by the Bronte sisters as the years passed by. She considers how they defined themselves as women, how their gender was perceived by others, how they interacted as sisters, and what it meant that all of them were writers. So this book is definitely on my general list, but perhaps not on this month's immediate TBR. The Victober General Challenge is to read a Victorian book while wearing something Victorian or Victorian related, and to share on social media. I'm starting today with the Victober T-Shirt, which you can see in the thumbnail, a treat I purchased after Kate Howe shared the information. I'll link to the Etsy site in the comments. There definitely will be more Victorian outfits this coming month. I have an idea or 2, but no specific plans quite yet. You might be seeing me dressed up as the fortune teller in Jane Eyre. We'll see. I am so looking forward to seeing what everyone else puts together for their clothing choices. Finally, Kate Howe and Natalie from Curious Reader have put together a crafting audiobook combination, Star-Crossed Stitchers. Although I don't think I'll be listening to the Thomas Hardy book they've chosen, although I would love to get to it at some point, and I think I will be knitting rather than cross-stitching, I'm at least partially joining their fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing their progress. I'll be listening to parts of one of the books I've already mentioned. I'm not a great audiobook listener, but I've definitely realized that I do well when I'm listening to rereads. That makes Jane Eyre seem like a possibility. I also know that Juliet Stevens reads Middlemarch. She's an amazing reader, and while I know I'll be reading most of Middlemarch from the book, I might listen occasionally. My library's digital service has both of these, as well as Jude the Obscure and Tenant of Wildfell Hall. If any of you have suggestions from these choices, I'd love to hear. Books that you think worked especially well on audiobook or with specific narrators. Thanks for any input. The pattern I plan to knit is the Resistance Cowl, designed by Carissa Browning in honor of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Until the election here in the States at the beginning of November, the designer will donate all proceeds from the sale of the pattern to the American Civil Liberties Union. I had considered knitting this cowl before, and I'd even thought that if I did, I would wear it with a pink pussy hat on Election Day. But now that so many of us are mourning her death, knitting this collar seems far more timely. It will be a tribute to her talents and to her power, as well as perhaps a way to help me control what are sometimes paralyzing fears about what's happening in the American political world right now. I can try to justify that the cowl's knitted representation of beaded jewelry might be especially appropriate for a month celebrating the Victorian period, but honestly, I'll be knitting it because of the cowl's relevance for the current moment. Incidentally, a friend of mine very recently crocheted something similar and turned it into a contribution to public art. My quirky neighborhood has a statue of a rooster as its spirit animal, all in memory of a real rooster that used to roam our inside the Beltway urban suburb in D.C. My friend provided the RBG collar for him, just what he needed right now. Nearly 4 years ago, he was wearing a pink pussy hat, too. All right, I can't wait for Victober to get started, and I can't wait to hear all about all of your Victorian adventures, too. The weather has turned cooler here in the D.C. area, and it really has me in the mood for reading Victorian classics. I don't think I associated Victorian literature with autumn in any way before I discovered Booktube, but Katie and all her associates have totally made that link absolutely indelible for me. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.